Myanmar's leader Aung San Suu Kyi gave her first address to her country after it was attacked by Rohingya Muslims. Suu Kyi condemned the human rights violations in the Rakhine state and said that violators would be brought to justice, but did not address the UN accusations of a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Rohingya Muslims. Now, this has sparked a military response and forced more than 400,000 Rohingyas to flee to nearby Bangladesh. Rohingya refugees who arrived in Bangladesh say that soldiers and Buddhist civilians burned villages just as recent as last week. In fact, Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina says she spoke to U.S. President Donald Trump about the plight of the Rohingya Muslims flooding her country, but says she expects no help from the United States. She's also urging for more aid. The big question is, will they go back to Myanmar if there is support and aid? Now, the UN Rights has now described this, saying that the army and the Rakhine Buddhist vigilantes have mounted a campaign of arson to drive out the Muslim population, calling it ethnic cleansing. Of course, Myanmar rejecting this, saying the forces were simply defending against insurgents. Myanmar's government says 400 people so far have died in that fighting. Let's bring WION's senior foreign editor Padma Rao into the conversation. Padma, thanks for joining us tonight. Aung San Suu Kyi's speech, what do we make of that?
Well, Aung San Suu Kyi's speech was really addressed much more to the international, there's been an outpouring of criticism specifically directed against Ms. Suu Kyi, because Ms. Suu Kyi was, up to now, as you know, almost a poster girl for Western democracies, especially during the 10 years she was incarcerated and was under house arrest. There seems to be a kind of fall from grace, and I say that with a great amount of irony, because what Ms. Suu Kyi's really done is just turn pragmatic once she, came into mainstream politics. So she has addressed primarily a Western audience, and she has even extended an invitation to them to come and visit Rakhine. And she firmly maintains that the action that is being undertaken by the armed forces of Myanmar in the Rakhine state are specifically directed against an armed militant uprising, which was responsible for the attack and the killing of 12 policemen in August this year. So her speech was really a kind of a response to the international criticism that has been mounting since that attack, and since the Rohingyas began to flee to Bangladesh.
You know, Padma, certainly a very difficult situation there when it comes to that. At this point, I mean, the plight of the Rohingyas seems, very difficult to tell. Do we think that if there is aid, if there is help, that many of them may even consider going back, or is that really unlikely at this point? I mean, Sheikh Hasina even said she talked to Trump, but is not expecting a whole lot of help from the United States.
Well, I think, that question is best answered by Rohingyas themselves, and I think we will be doing so on our channel very soon. But what I'd like to say is that unless there is an absolute assurance of long-term security on the ground, because let's not forget that these are indeed Muslims from Bengal. They came in there, they've been there as long as since the 12th century. So it's not as if they're recent immigrants or, refugees that strolled straight across the Bangladesh-Myanmar border in recent times. So, and there's been a long history of persecution. This is not the first time. There's been a long history of clashes between Buddhist nationalists in Rakhine. And indeed, that is one of Ms. Suu Kyi's problems, that the Buddhist Nationalist Party, which has the largest presence in the local assembly in Rakhine, is one of the few parties in Myanmar which is not part of her national coalition that won the elections. So she has to, she has a very tightrope. She has to do a lot of tightrope walking. She has to keep the Buddhist nationalists in Rakhine happy. She has to keep the majority of Myanmar happy. And the majority of Myanmar is not for the return of the Rohingyas. They want them deported. They do not see them as citizens of Myanmar. And finally, she has to keep the military junta happy, which is, never mind her charisma and, the fact that she's very famous and she's a Nobel laureate, and she's also the foreign minister and the state councillor Chancellor.
Right.
The essential ministries are all in the hands of the army, as is the power to dismiss a democratically elected government should she or this government do anything that goes against national security from the military's point of view.
Yeah, interesting perspective there indeed. Padma, thank you for those updates. Well, in the past few weeks, in fact, WION has been bringing you all the reports which unveil a link between the radicalized Rohingyas and the terrorist organizations like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, even the ISI. Now, in her address to the nation, Myanmar's Aung San Suu Kyi did raise the same concerns. Here's a quick background story on that. All right, we'll try to come back to that story in just a second. In the meantime, let me bring in our correspondent Raghavendra Rao joining us now from the newsroom. Raghavendra, you know, when it comes to the plight of the Rohingyas, in fact, even in India, there was some trepidation, some concern, some back and forth about whether or not they really would be able to find home here, given that there was some perhaps a trepidation of terror on India's soil. I mean, it's a very fine line to draw, providing refuge at the same time protecting its own interests.
Indeed, Archit, and the Indian government's stance before the country's apex court, the Supreme Court, has been that Rohingya refugees, 40,000 of them are in India at the moment, and the Indian government's stance has been that they are indeed a security threat because the government of India has credible enough reason to believe that these refugees could have links with terror outfits or could be in the process of getting radicalized by the likes of Lashkar-e-Taiba and even the ISIS. Now, this is what the Indian government has been telling the apex court. Also, the fact that so many of these Rohingyas are living in even in Delhi, the national capital, as well as cities like Jammu, and they have been here for a while. It is not as if they have just come overnight, but the fact that they are here and the Indian government sees them as a potential security threat, they have been arguing before the Supreme Court that deporting these Rohingyas is a decision basically intended to safeguard the country's security. Now, those who are opposing this, the people, the likes of Prashant Bhushan, Kapil Sibal and Fali Nariman, who are arguing the case as petitioners for the Rohingyas, they have been citing various articles of the Indian Constitution. They have also been citing the principle of non-refoulement, which prohibits deporting refugees back to a country where there is a fear of their persecution. Now, all these arguments have already been made before the Supreme Court. What the government of India thinks about the matter further is to be decided or is to be brought before the apex court on October 3rd. But clearly, this is not the last we have heard on this matter so far. And as we go along, we will see more voices coming in from both sides. Another argument which the petitioners and the people, the representatives of the Rohingyas in India, they have been making is that these people have been around for a while and they have so far not been found to have been engaging in any kind of subversive activities. Not a single case has been registered where these people could have had any links to any terror outfits. Now, those submissions, those arguments have been made, but the Indian government's stance so far has been that a state has a sovereign right to defend itself, its security, and it is the security angle which the Indian government has been trying to underline before the apex court.
All right, Raghavendra, in fact, let's see if we can get that story where it talks about the link of the radicalization and perhaps what exactly Suu Kyi hopes to achieve. Here's a report.
After 3 weeks of violence, Aung San Suu Kyi broke her silence to address the nation and the world. She conceded that her government is concerned about the mass exodus from Rakhine, but also maintained that security forces had to respond to terrorist attacks by armed Rohingyas.
After several months of seemingly quiet and peace, on the 25th of August, 30 police outposts, as well as the regimental headquarters in Damlanza village, were attacked by armed groups. Consequent to these attacks, the government declared the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army and its supporters responsible for acts of terrorism as a terrorist group in accordance with the Counter-Terrorism Law, Section 6, Subsection 5.
Suu Kyi's words are in line with the position taken by the government of India, which has decided to deport the Rohingya citing security concerns. The Rakhine Rohingya Salvation Army, which has staged 2 deadly attacks on Myanmar security forces, has been receiving training and tactile support from terrorist organizations like the Lashkar-e-Toiba as well as Pakistan's ISI. Indian intelligence agencies have echoed similar concerns on the basis of telephone intercepts between the Rohingya military chief and the ISI. The collated evidence will be presented before the Indian Supreme Court in a sealed envelope on the 3rd of October. The Rohingya pose a security challenge for Indian authorities. 40,000 Rohingya are living in the country, but less than 15,000 have legal documents to justify their presence. Suu Kyi has offered to take back some of them, but only after a thorough verification process. The sharp rise in the influx of the Rohingya has raised concerns in Bangladesh as well. Local authorities and aid agencies have failed to keep up with the growing numbers. Not only do they pose logistical challenges, they make ideal breeding and recruiting ground for terrorist outfits. The mass exodus could change demographics in Indian states which share a border with Bangladesh. The government of India, in its affidavit to the Supreme Court, had raised this issue, arguing that terrorist organizations could use refugees to carry out attacks. Bureau Report, WION.
WION's Bangladesh Bureau Chief Saad Hamadi spoke to a Rohingya refugee on the ground to describe the situation in Dhaka. Let's listen in.
আচ্ছা এটা বাস্তব বস আমি শুনি না আমার কিন্তু বিশ্বাস হচ্ছে না ওরা নেবে না ওরা এখন দেখেন ওরা একটা প্ল্যান ছিল দেখেন এখন ওরা যদি নিতে পারে হ্যাঁ কিন্তু ওরা রাইট দেবে আর এখানে যারা চলে আসছেন জান প্রাণ বাঁচিয়ে যারা নিজেকে নিজে বাইরে বাংলাদেশ আসতে পারছেন ওরা যদি আপনি মারি ফেলেন ওরা যদি রাইট না দেন রোহিঙ্গা রাইট ন্যাশনালিটি না দেন কাউ যাবে না আমি আমার কথা বলছি আল্লাহর কসম খেয়ে বলছি আমাকে যদি ন্যাশনালিটি ওখানে মায়ানমার না দেন আমি যাব না আমি বিষ খাওয়াইয়া যদি বাংলাদেশ সরকার আমাকে ফোর্স করে যদি বাংলাদেশ সরকার আমাকে জোর করে পাঠাইয়ার চেষ্টা করে আল্লাহর কসম খেয়ে বলছি আমি ওখানে যাই মরবো না ওখানে যে আমি কবরও পাবো না জনতা পাবো না এখানে যদি আমি বিষ খেয়ে মরি আমাকে জনতা দিবে এখানে কিন্তু আমার বাচ্চাদেরকে আমি বিষ খেয়ে মারবো আল্লাহর কসম আমি ওখানে যাবো না মায়ানমারে যাবো না কিন্তু মায়ানমারের সিচুয়েশন আপনারা নিজে দেখতে পাচ্ছেন বুঝছেন হাজার হাজার লোক লাখ লাখ লোক ওখানে আসতেছে একটা ফ্যামিলি পুরো ফ্যামিলিকে নিয়ে পার্সনকে নিয়ে এখানে আসতে পারে নাই কারণ কেউ না কেউ নাহলে মারা গেছে নাহলে কাটা খাইছে নাহলে ওই যে আপনার জ্বলি গেছে এইভাবেই ওরা আসছে কিন্তু ওইখানে যে আমরা এরা মরতে চাই না কিন্তু আপনি আমাকে যদি বাংলাদেশে যদি জোর করে আমার অধিকার ছাড়া যদি আমাকে যদি মায়ানমার দেয় আল্লাহর কসম খেয়ে বলতেছি সব আমার ফ্যামিলি বিষ খেয়ে আমি বিষ খেয়ে এখানে মরে যাব কিন্তু এখান থেকে এক বরাবর ফসন বরাবর আমরা লড়বো না বাংলাদেশ থেকে এটা আমার বক্তব্য এটা আমার পার্সোনাল থেকে নিজের অভিজ্ঞতা থেকে বলছি কিন্তু আর মায়ানমার যাতে বলছে আমাদেরকে নেবে ওদেরকে তো শেষ করা হয়েছে ওরা তো আমাদেরকে যদি এখন আবুল তাবুল করে নিয়ে যাইও তাহলে ওরা লাভবান আছে কারণ আমাদের অনেক লোককে হত্যা করে পারতেছে এরা অনেক লোককে হত্যা করছে এরা আপনারাই জানেন পুরো ওয়ার্ল্ডে জানে কিন্তু এখন যদি নেয় তাহলে এখন নেওয়া